Hi, Erin.
Hi, Kim. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good.
Welcome
Good.
back to
Aside
the.
from the rainy weather,
Yeah,
we had
I
sun.
know. I know.
Where did it
Well,
go?
welcome back to the show. And
Yes.
today you're going to be talking about storytelling. And
Yes.
how did you first become interested in storytelling?
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on again. I always love chatting with you. As you know, we could chat for hours, but we won't. We
And
won't
we
let people
have.
do that. And we have. Yeah, it's funny. I feel like it was just a really natural evolution for me when I was a little kid. I started reading really, really young. I started writing pretty much as soon as I knew how to read. And so I started writing little short stories. And I think, we like to be acknowledged when we're good at something. We like to be rewarded for that, and that sticks with us. And so I in second grade, I wrote this short story and I submitted it at school to like this young writers contest. And I won, I think like third place or something. And I got a t-shirt, and that was it for me. I was like, yes, like I'm a writer. And so it's just always been a part of me. I've always really identified, like, a huge part of my identity is a writer. And so I feel like it just kind of evolved career wise and everything until um, had lots of conversations with other folks in the business world, and they kept telling me, "You're a storyteller. You're a storyteller." So sort of like actually labeling myself that way came from other people who saw me that way.
So were you writing stories from then on?
Oh yeah, I
Were you
have.
entering more contests too?
I never really did enter more contests, but it's funny you mention that because I've been wanting to, I've been kind of on this, as you know, this hiatus from doing a lot of my creative work. And I was just telling another writer friend that, I wanted to, my goal was to identify 3 publications this month to submit, personal essay to. And she sent me a link to a contest. And so I thought maybe I should do that, kind of come full circle.
Wow. What is the difference between an essay and an actual, like, what would you call article or story or book? I mean,
Yeah.
what exactly is an essay? How would you describe that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's a really good question because honestly, there's so many different forms of writing, right? So people, whenever someone meets me and they say, "Well, what do you do?" The simplest answer for me is to say, "Well, I'm a writer." But, I do
Right.
lots of other things, right? And so they go, "Anything I've read," because they immediately think you're a novelist. And unfortunately, I'm not. That's not, it's not that exciting. I'm not over here like writing, romance novels or mysteries, although I think writing a mystery would be very fun. But an essay can be anything from, in school, we think about essays as like school assignments, right? Like write an essay on,
Exactly.
the Civil War, whatever. And that's not really fun. But so that's more of like an analytical essay or like an expository essay or something like that. But a personal essay is something where we take an experience from our life, we take a moment from our life or a series of moments from our lives, and we share those in a way that is telling, you know, it's probably not our whole life story because that would be a book or a series of books, right?
Right.
But it's telling a slice of the story of like a slice of our life, and it's going to have some kind of like moral or lesson or introspective lesson or discovery or something like that. So there's, if you think about, if you've ever read, of course I'm so bad when it comes to like naming people. It's David Sedaris, is that right? The humorist. He does like the radio. I'll probably get it wrong and your listeners will probably be like, oh my God, but he's hilarious. And he does these like funny essays. So that would be an example of an essay. um if you've read Brene Brown, which I have a feeling you have, and we've
Of
probably
course.
talked about that before, her books are kind of put together as a series of essays. Like
Oh,
one chapter will be, if you read a chapter and you realize that it may speak to the larger narrative of her book, but it is usually like some experience she had and what she took from that and something that we can take from that. So that's kind of how I look at the personal essay.
that's
Does
interesting.
that
I think
does
my
that
life,
help?
yeah, I think my life is a series of essays.
It is absolutely everybody's. I always say this because, and you've attended some of my like talks on
Oh,
storytelling and
yes. And
stuff, so
they're
you probably
wonderful.
Thank you. You've probably heard me say this, but like people say, well, I don't have a story. Nothing really exciting in my
Yes.
life happens. I don't have, but we all have these, our lives are a series of essays. Our lives are all of these vignettes, as they call them in writing. And so every lived experience is a story. It's just about learning how to craft those in a way that you're kind of sharing the significance of that with the reader or the listener.
Yeah. And so what techniques do you use to craft a compelling story and to also to engage an audience?
Yeah, well, that's a another great question, Kim. You always ask the good
I'm
questions,
full
but
of them.
you are full of them, but they're also big questions, right? Because how do you go about crafting a story? That is like there's so many pieces to that, but I think, the first thing to do is sort of sit down and brain dump. Maybe just kind of start journaling and kind of going tracing back through your memory. You can use writing prompts, right? I think a lot of people feel like they have to have all this information right here, but we can look at outside sources for inspiration. We can look for writing prompts, and maybe it's even like think of a time when you were a kid that and I don't want to call you out on this, but I feel like you and I had a conversation about like our anxiety about going to school when we were a kid, right? Like, so think about something that you were like really scared of as a kid, or a moment that changed, or, anything like that. And just start like brain dumping those in a journal. And I feel like we just kind of intuitively gravitate toward one that we're like, I can say a lot about that. That was significant. That was a significant moment to me. So that's a good starting point. And then the other part of crafting a story that I'd say is like next step is to recognize that every story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so, take that moment and say, where did it start? What was sort of like the crux of this, right? Like that peak moment of fear or overcoming or, whatever it is. And then how am I going to wrap this up? And admittedly, ending your story for me is one of the hardest parts, because you want it to end with like a punch, right? You want it to like land with the reader or the listener and say like this is what I'm supposed to be taking away from this. It feels like it was tied up in a nice little bow. So that can be really challenging, but I think those are kind of the first steps to crafting a story.
And so when you're talking about stories, are you talking about writing the story so people can read it? Or are you talking about stories where you go tell it on a stage? And also, does it matter if you have like a boring voice? Because
No.
I've been
Okay.
listening to audibles and I just
Oh,
listened to Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. I don't know if you've listened
oh
to it.
yeah.
That
No,
is the
but highly
most,
recommend.
that's the most awesome story I've ever heard. Just his whole, the way he tells it, it had
Yeah.
me, I mean, I'm walking around my block every day listening and I'm just walking by myself and I start bursting out laughing. And I thought,
Yeah.
I can't like put this down. And so I always test the narrators when I'm doing audibles first to see if I
Yeah.
can handle their voice. So does that matter to you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so first of all, I have to
Yeah.
say that book is on my list because I have another
Oh,
friend who she told me the same thing. She's
oh,
like,
it's so good.
and I do a lot of just actual reading of books. I listen to podcasts, I read books. I don't do as much audiobooks, but I can totally understand why that one is one you need to listen to, because it's narrated by the man himself and his voice is amazing and
Yeah,
it's
and
like butter and it's
if you want to know how to tell a story, I mean, I think that's like a good lesson. And listening to him, he's doing all the
absolutely.
voices of all the people. It's just,
Yeah, well,
it's
you
great.
just made a fantastic point. One of the best ways to learn how to tell a story is to go read other people's stories or listen to other people's stories. Like that is huge. If you're not a reader, if you're not, engaging in, listening to these kind of stories, then, I feel like you're doing yourself a disservice. If you want to tell stories, you have to, consume other people's and see how
Right.
they're doing it and pick up what you like and don't like. So that is a fantastic point. I'm glad you kind of underscored that. Now I'm trying to remember. Oh, like going back to your original question. This is
I
what
know
we do, Kim.
I asked, that was a big question with
That's
a
okay.
lot of
No, I
detail.
remember what you said. So I think, your story, you can tell your story however you want. If you love to write or you want to write, then write, reach out to different publications and see if you can get those published. Publish them on your own site, publish them on Medium or LinkedIn or wherever you can sort of, publicly publish these stories. Or you can tell the stories on stage, like you said. And that's for any, whether you want to be like a motivational speaker or you want to be a speaker in some niche, healthcare or business or whatever, you can incorporate your stories, and you should incorporate your stories because they're engaging, right? So you can tell these stories however you want, or through a podcast, right? You could literally just have a storytelling podcast where you're sharing your experiences, or you have other people on to share their stories. So many different ways, basically whatever kind of speaks to you, whatever medium speaks to you. And to answer your other, like the sort of follow-up question of does the voice matter? And I mean, that's so subjective. I'd say yes and no, right? So I actually just was reading an article about a gal who is an audiobook narrator. Like that's her full-time,
Oh.
she's a freelance like audiobook person, right? And she actually has voice training in opera and everything. So yeah, so of course her voice is fantastic. She can project, she knows how to write. She's not going to like go into vocal fry or whatever. So I think that to a lot of people, yes, listening to a pleasant voice is important to them. I've heard people say, I can't listen to that podcast because something about their
Yes.
voice like doesn't work for me, right? But that's so subjective because that person also has lots of other listeners who their voice doesn't bother them, right? Because we're all different. So, yes and no. It does matter, but I wouldn't get hung up on it. If you want to tell your story in an audio format, then go for it, So I'm sure there's some people who can't stand to listen to me, but that's okay.
Oh, no, no. So when you're writing a story, how do you make it compelling so people want to hear it or read it? Are there secrets to
You know,
writing or?
yeah, I don't know that there are secrets. I think there are definitely, you know, um, sort of skills that you can hone um, to make your writing more engaging. But I will say that we naturally tell stories, right? We're natural storytellers. It's one of the oldest forms of communication. So that's what we do when we get together with friends. When you and I got together for lunch
Oh
last
my
time,
gosh.
it
Yeah.
was just story back and forth, right? Because you tell a story and then I go, oh my gosh, I know how you feel because this happened to me, and it's like a related sort of story, right? So that's what people do naturally. So I would say, look at how many like reality TV shows there are and how we're just sort of following these other people's lives, which is just a series of little stories, and we're sucked into that. I don't watch reality TV anymore. When I was younger, I did, but I got sucked into it. And so I know that if I'm just going to sit there and watch hours of reality television. Um, and so I think that we can tell our stories without being these super talented, amazing top tier storyteller writers. At the same time, one of the best things you can do to make your story more engaging and more compelling is to, there are a few things. One, you can build in a lot of sensory details. So if we think about, I'm sure that Matthew McConaughey in his stories, he's probably really painting a picture for you. He might be
Oh,
talking about the smell of something when he walked into a room. I mean, I haven't read the book, so I'm just making things up. The sounds, right? He's describing the visual of something, the colors. So I think one of the things that people tend to do is they tend to just sort of like document rather than describe. And so if we go back through our story and say, how can I make this come alive to the reader or the listener? Thinking about each of your senses. What did this smell like? What did this look like? Right. So that's one of the best things you can do to really draw people in and make it more engaging, I would say. And then one of the other things is pacing, right? So kind of, I think editing is really great. Go back through your story and say, is there any part of this that really doesn't need to be here or slows things down? I heard, and I wish I could reference where I heard this or read this, but it's been so long ago that I don't remember. But, ask yourself as you're writing the story or you're reviewing the story, and then what happened? And then what happened? And then what happened? And so you can kind of like think about the pacing, because you want people to be asking as they read each line of your story, okay, and then what happened? So that's another sort of trick, I guess, to make sure your story is really compelling.
Okay. How can people use storytelling maybe at work? Can this help with people at work?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, like in a professional setting, if they have
Yeah.
a 9 to 5, okay, perfect. So, one of the things that, I mean, so many ways. So, I'm just going to dive into one area and we can go from there. Presentations. If you have to give a presentation, or something at a meeting, and I know a lot of people hate doing that, one of the best things you can do to make sure the room is focused on you, or they're not falling asleep, is incorporate stories into your presentation. So I think that is way up there, and I think being an engaging presenter is a really important skill. Because I've attended some presentations that you just are like, when is this over, right? But if they're
Right.
telling stories and they're entertaining you, then you're focused on it, you're into it, and you're going to remember and retain the information better too. So that's one way. I think also, networking, whether it's with, I don't know if you work in a big office space and you want to meet other people and sort of like, do some lateral movements. I know someone who wanted to go from sales into communications, for example. And so, how do you start sort of networking and building relationships? Start having a conversation with them, share some stories, ask them, about their story. So, even on those sort of personal level, right, you can do
Yeah.
that. Networking events.
Yeah.
I know that's not like,
How would you do that at a networking event if you don't know any of the people and you want to share
yeah.
your biz? Like, yeah, how do you do that?
Yeah, no, to share your business, like what you do, without just
Yeah.
like coming up to them and pitching, right? Because
Right.
that's what most people do. Um, I think it's really about starting, introducing yourself, asking them first. I think, this is not exactly about storytelling, but I think it ties in. People want to talk about themselves. So
Yeah.
honestly, they're going to remember you if you're just like so engrossed in them and their
Yes.
story. So, right, it's like, Kim, tell me about like what you do. And oh my gosh, like, well, how did you get started in that? Let them tell, encourage them to tell their origin story, right? Encourage them to share more story. How did you deal with that? Like, how did you get to the, well, gosh, that's an interesting trajectory. Tell me about that. So asking them to share their story with you, man, their brain is like firing. It's so happy because they're telling a story, they're talking about themselves. And then if they are self aware, they'll turn around and say, well, I've been talking about myself so much. What do you do, Kim? And then you get to, right? So
Does
then
that
you get to sort
happen?
of,
Does that
oh,
really
yeah,
happen?
it depends on the person,
Yeah.
right? And my brain is like wanting to say, at networking events, we all know who just continues to talk about themselves and not be self-aware. Um, but the other thing is, if they don't do that, you can sort of do what I was saying earlier when you and I were at lunch, right? If they say, "Oh, well, I went to school to do this, this, this," look for those little connection points where your story overlaps with theirs, and go, "Oh my gosh, I went to the same school," or "I have a friend who worked there." Just like keep your ears open for those parts of the story that you have a connection point to, because I think about our stories as sort of a Venn diagram. So you and I, perhaps we live very different lives. Maybe we have very different, and I know you and I actually do have a lot in common, but
We
we
do.
have a lot of different hobbies, or we're from different generations, or we have different, upbringing, whatever. But your story is this circle and my story is this circle, but ultimately there's always going to be overlap, right? There's always going to be, we're humans. The more people you start talking to and really sharing stories with, the more you realize how much every human has shared experiences in some way, shape, or form. And so it's just about looking for that overlap and those connection points, I think, and just interjecting with your own story. And And they're not going to feel like you're, then talking about yourself or pitching yourself, because you are still relating to them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think storytelling can promote healing and wellness?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. So one thing we know is that, and I don't remember all the numbers, I should have like done my homework, but our brains, the serotonin, all of those like happy chemicals and those chemicals that make us feel empathy and compassion and everything, those are actually multiplied when we engage in the storytelling process. So why, do you see women who get together for their lunch or have their coffee date and they're just like laughing and they're so happy when they're together? Because they're sitting around sharing stories and feeling that deep connection and empathy, right? Like studies have shown that stories can help us empathize, and that's really important, I think, for us as humans to feel whole and well and happy. So that's one way. I think another way is through, you know, rewriting our own stories, reframing those
Mm.
stories that may be weighing on us, that may be really difficult, right?
Like maybe a different
Many ways.
perspective.
Exactly. Like looking at your story from, and it sounds so cheesy and trite, and you may, people don't like to hear this, and sometimes there are certain situations where it feels really bad to say look for the silver lining, right? But it
Right.
doesn't have to be that. It can still be like, this experience sucked, right? It, whether it was like abuse or whatever the case, it sucked. But how, like, dig and rewrite that and say, how did this make me stronger, or what did I learn from this? And again, I know that feels crappy because I had some of those situations and an upbringing where there were a lot of really bad situations. But over the years, so I used to be the kind of person, and you're probably going to go, what? You're so like happy and positive and whatever. But I used to be the kind of person who literally, something bad would happen, like even small, I spill my coffee, right? And I would go, oh, why do bad things always happen to
Oh,
me? I have the worst luck, right? Like, why do bad things always happen to me? And ultimately, like, what would happen? More bad things would happen throughout the day.
right.
And whether that's because then you're in a bad mood and you're just kind of being careless or whatever, or because you're focusing on all of those little bad things, right? Whatever the
Exactly.
case, then it just reinforces this idea, bad things always happen to me. And one day, because I've done a lot of work over the years on like personal development and wanting to improve, my life. And one day I just realized, are bad things happening to me, or is life just happening? And it happens to everybody, and it's how I'm responding to how these things are
Yes.
happening, right?
Yes.
And when I chose to recognize that and change how I responded, now more often than not, like there are days when I'm just like, life is so good, life is so good. And that doesn't mean I don't have bad days. And that doesn't mean I don't get, frustrated if I spill my coffee or whatever. But I feel like you can take things like water off a duck's back, right? More easily when you start to rewrite that story of, bad things don't always happen to me. Things just happen. Life happens. It happens to everybody. And it's how I choose to respond. So I think it's the same with your story. If you have these stories that are weighing on you, why did this happen to me? Why did that happen to me? And you feel like the victim, and you are, that's okay. Like, you can recognize that things happened to you and you are a victim, right? But how can you rewrite that to empower yourself and say, okay, I'm not going to be the victim anymore, right? I'm going to use my story and change how it's going forward. Because just like we were talking about earlier, our lives are a series of essays. That slice of your life, that one essay, that one story that happened, it's not your entire narrative. It's one piece of your narrative. So how are you going to change the narrative going forward and still acknowledge that this, thing happened to you? Does
Yeah.
that does that answer the question of, I know we were talking about wellness, but I
Whatever the
feel like,
question was.
yeah.
Yeah. And everything that happens to you is a learning experience too. And even if you
Absolutely.
spilled your coffee, that's like one moment. That doesn't mean you
Exactly.
ruined your whole day. That's one
Exactly.
30-second moment. It doesn't have
Yep.
to ruin your day, right?
Yes. Right. And some people do carry that with them through the rest of the day, right? That
Yes.
they carry that and then they start to see all the other little things like, oh, that person cut me off in traffic, or, whatever, the printer's not working. Like, and then all these little things just feel so big. But if sort of like let it go from the beginning, I feel like you don't really notice the big things. I have a senior dog. I know you do too.
Oh, yes.
Um, if I was still in that same place that I used to be, I would probably constantly be so frustrated and irritated because he steps in the water bowl. Because he's not really as aware as he used to be, and you just have to go, you know, it's just water. Don't cry over spilt milk,
I
kind of
love it.
thing.
Don't
Yeah,
cry over spilled water.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
mine flipped her food bowl the other day, totally
Oh
upside
yeah.
down with all the food in it. Like,
Yeah.
okay. But I'm not
Yeah.
gonna say, oh my gosh, my day is ruined. No,
Exactly.
just go
Yeah.
clean it up. She's a senior. That's what happens with senior dogs. We love them no matter what,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I was
So
gonna
you've just
ask,
changed the story.
yeah, exactly. So I was going to ask you about, you kind of covered it a little bit, but can storytelling help with stress?
Wow. I think that's a good question. I hadn't thought about it that way. I think absolutely, because as we talked about, the chemicals, the happy chemicals in our brain. And so I think even if it's just I'm going to read a book, I'm going to listen to Matthew McConaughey tell stories, I'm going to get with friends and share stories, like automatically puts us in that happier brain space. So I think, if you're dealing with stress, maybe pop in some earbuds and listen to a good story, or sit down and read for a few minutes, engage in that storytelling process. So 100% in that way. And then also going back to what we were talking about with journaling. And if something did happen that is stressing you out, and maybe it's bigger than spilled coffee, maybe it's something at work that happened to you, maybe, I
Right.
mean, there's so many layoffs happening right now, right?
Yes.
Um, Writing about it is such a release. I mean, I feel like when you write it out, I'm the kind of person who will play something over and over if I'm frustrated, right? I'm just like
Oh, yes. Don't we all?
marinating on it,
Yeah.
right? And you're going over and over it. But if you write it out, then
Yeah.
there's this release. It exists somewhere. And now you don't have to just go over it and over it in your brain. And then doing some journaling to rewrite that and say, what are my options? How can I, like, where do I go from here? What is the next part of my story? For me anyway, and I think for anybody, if they let themselves, because a lot of people go, I don't like to write, but I think if you just spend some time with it, I feel like it's such a great self-discovery process. I'm sure because you write a lot as well.
Oh
When
gosh.
you're writing, do you ever feel like that where you go, oh my gosh, I just learned something about myself, or this piece went in a direction that I didn't even expect it to necessarily, because I had this like aha moment as I was writing.
Yeah, that happens a
So
lot.
yeah, exactly. So I think it's just such a mood boosting thing in general, to listen to it, to share stories, or to write your own story.
Yeah, and I think when you're doing a brain dump and getting it out onto paper, you get it out of your head onto paper.
And
It is
yeah,
a stress reliever. And also you are kind of writing a story, right?
absolutely.
About
Yeah.
whatever you're feeling at the time. It's your
Yep.
story and how you're feeling at the time. So
Yeah. If you think about that thing that frustrated you, it is a story. If you got laid off, it's the story of your being laid off, right? So every moment, like I said, every lived experience is absolutely a story. If you start looking at it that way, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, stories are all around me.
yeah, so you are storytellingyou.com.
Yeah.
What tell all of us, what do you do?
Yes, I teach online business owners, like coaches, consultants, course creators, how to uncover their unique stories. So, just like we've been talking about, and then use those stories to grow their audience, authority, and impact. So, help them figure out how to navigate that publishing process if they want to get their story out there, build some PR, use storytelling in their newsletters, for example, to engage their audience, use storytelling in in sales sequences or sales pages, webinars, right? There's
Yes.
so many ways that online business owners can use stories to connect with their audience and compel them into action. So that's what I help them do, craft their stories.
So do you actually write the stories for them, or do you tell them to go write a story and then you look at it and go, nope, that's not going to work. Change this.
Yeah, I do both. So I do some copywriting, website copy a lot of the time. But then I will also review people's stories. So an example would be a client I had who had like a 10-part email sequence where she kind of wanted each email to build towards selling her course. And so she hired me to review that sequence. And so I'll do like a number of sessions with that person, right? So
Oh,
they submit the copy to me, and then I review it. We have a session and go over sort of like the feedback. So that's another way that I work with people. And then, as you know, I run, and I haven't done it in too long, but like workshops and courses to teach people these methods and sort of just encourage them to share and do feedback live on the call.
do you have any coming up or not yet?
Not planned, I know, but you're such a good person to keep me like on the ball. So
Yeah, that's me. So people can find you at storytelling you with a U
.com.
dot
Yes, you like
com.
university. Yep. So
And then they can also find you where?
so pretty much on every social site at Candidly Erin. So yeah,
Okay.
that's it. That's where I am everywhere. I'm on
Okay.
LinkedIn too. I'm Erin R. Sanchez on LinkedIn.
Okay. And then is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to talk about?
No, I think you did a fantastic job. I
I
mean, I could talk
did.
all day. I could talk all day, but I know we have time constraints, and so no, I think you just about covered it.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for coming back. I hope you come back again, especially
Oh,
when you have a new course out
yes.
or a new
Yes.
workshop to because I want you to come and talk all about it. It's so exciting
Yeah.
what you do.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for having me on. And absolutely, I can come back anytime and I'll try to get something in the works so I have something to promote.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming and I will see you soon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.